ಸುಶೀಲಾ ಗೋಪಾಲನ್ ನೆನಪಿನ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಉಪನ್ಯಾಸ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವು ಡಿಸೆಂಬರ್ 17ರಂದು ನಡೆಯಿತು. ಅಖಿಲ ಭಾರತ ಜನವಾದಿ ಮಹಿಳಾ ಸಂಘಟನೆ ಮತ್ತು ಸುಶೀಲಾ ಗೋಪಾಲನ್ ಮೆಮೋರಿಯಲ್ ಟ್ರಸ್ಟ್ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನು ಆಯೋಜಿಸಿತ್ತು. ಸಂಘರ್ಷದ ನಡುವೆ ನಲುಗಿದ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರು ಮತ್ತು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಎಂಬ ವಿಷಯದ ಕುರಿತು ಚಿಂತಕರಾದ ಗೀತಾ ಹರಿಹರನ್ ವಿಷಯ ಮಂಡಿಸಿದರು.
It's a great honor for me to speak in memory of Sushila Gopalan, and I must start with a personal link. In 1981, when the All India Democratic Women's Association, or AIDWA, held its first national meeting in Chennai, I was a young volunteer. I wasn't a grey-head yet then. So seeing what was that experience like, seeing women leaders and activists, many of whom are no longer with us, but seeing them up close, hearing them speak, sing. In the middle of the night, somebody would get up and start singing. I remember Comrade Udayam would do that. Sing, express solidarity with each other's daily work and struggles. I learned what the women's movement was in lived terms, not in theory, not from a book, but what it is to live a movement, what it could be as movement, but also as a kind of large home for us, a family for ideas, a framework of values, for learning and discussion, and our growth towards political, social, and economic understanding, and so change, whether in workplaces, from the fields to factories, whether in classrooms or courts or streets, and perhaps hardest of all, the family. And of course, every woman knows why I'm saying that is the hardest place to bring about change. So what we speak of today continues the work of leaders such as Sushila Gopalan and women's organizations and the movement. The fight goes on. The struggle for a more equal world must go on. Women and children especially continue to be oppressed, not only on a daily basis by an unequal system, but also by the violence and specific deprivations of conflict situations in different parts of the world. I'm just going to say something about this word conflict, and then we'll ask Geeta to give an idea of what I'm talking about. This word conflict, this phrase conflict zone, we hear again and again today, whether it is by the media or the official spokespersons of governments or by international agencies such as the United Nations. And conflict as well as conflict zone are words used today to describe a range of short-term and long-term situations of unrest, upheaval, violence, and warfare. If we unpack, open up these sort of mysterious words, conflict zone, what do they actually mean? What are we able to reveal if we peel layer after layer of history and the politics of power structures? We see quite clearly long-term contexts of the present-day conflict, a context of historical displacement, dispossession, oppression through colonization, in particular, settler colonialism that has always meant, everywhere in the world, what can only be called genocide. In other words, clearing the land of its people to claim the land, to occupy it, which means, in effect, killing or expelling the people in the land, or reducing them to small pockets, aliens in their own land. There are several obvious examples that all of you can think of, but we forget them. The most obvious example we forget is the United States, Australia for another, Algeria. and so, of course, Palestine. So this is the context of historical oppression of a people, long-term subjugation, where policy itself, official policy, government policy, carries injustice. Where apartheid, the strange word, means different systems and policies for different people, that is officially sanctioned. I'm going to mention here parenthetically that apartheid might be an invention of other parts of the world. We have our version, of course, our horrible contribution to the world, which is caste. So we begin with this insight. The word conflict is a slippery one. It is used like a hold all. Remember, in the train we used to carry one hold all in our young days to cover and cover up different experiences of long-standing histories of colonization, occupation, militarization. As for zone, this neutral sounding word, which the United Nations likes because they like neutral sounding words, is just whitewash for land that has been forcibly settled or taken away by barbed wire fences or walls, checkpoints with armed soldiers, or roads and highways not to be used by people who have been reduced, diminished, alienated from their land, their history, so that their homes and even their memories of home are lost. Entire familiar territories, part of the community's shared idea of home, are erased by bulldozers or settlements or refugee camps or new names and landscapes. I ask you again, parenthetically, to remember where the bulldozer model came from to our own country. In other words, the people are reduced to being at the receiving end. They're reduced to subjects. They're not citizens. The conflict is by no means between equals. You will always see in the media that they'll say the Israel-Palestine conflict, or they will make it out as if the two are on equal ground. They're not. This is long drawn oppression by occupiers with weapons and the backing of powerful allies. This is something we, with our own experience of being colonized, should know, since we still deal with so many problems that are the legacies of our colonial experience. Now, it's important to keep this history in mind because it will help us to understand as we go on today why powerful countries in the West are able to spin a different story, a different narrative about the very visible, ongoing violence against innocent civilians, especially women and children, or even what can only be called genocide. Larger context, this background I've given, how does that apply to women in particular? And of course, where women go, can children be far behind? See, whether we are talking about areas where militarization, what do I mean by militarization? That the army or security forces, special forces are in place there and they actually impinge on the day-to-day life. They are part of the day-to-day life of the place. So whether we're talking of militarization, which we have seen in Kashmir, which we have seen over a period of time in the Northeast here, whether there are violent atrocities or whether there's out and out warfare, as we are seeing right now in West Asia, the experience or the experience of long-term occupation, what happens to women? Women anyway, even in peace times, even in zones, even in countries, even in towns which are not supposed to be in conflict, they already live their lives within patriarchal frameworks. So here you have a double situation. You have colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, police and policed. And then, of course, you have the patriarchal setup. So, in other words, let me put it in simple terms. Women have a lot of oppressors in a time of conflict, in a zone of conflict, because anyway, they live within those oppressive frameworks in ordinary times. So, the context, the important thing to remember is that gender inequality may manifest itself in different ways during conflict. So, but it becomes worse because of the conflict that is already there. So, if women already suffer from inequality, and women of certain classes and castes and communities suffer from a double inequality, then when there is a situation of conflict, there is one more layer of inequality. Some more problems present themselves. So this is how we need to see it, that it's not a simple, straightforward picture. Obviously, this picture is different in different places among women and children. It's different among the men, their families, and communities. What we want to say is that the lives of women and children are affected in multiple ways by the chronic, the historical, and the systemic, as well as by the immediate situation of war, occupation, or militarization. So that's enough for general lecture. Now I am going back to being a writer, and I want to tell you stories about people in places, because we can only understand conflict if we look at what it's doing to women and children, specific women and children. So let's start with militarization. A militarized situation in public and private spaces, which has been the case with Kashmir since 1989, roughly. So I want to talk about some of the real people I have met over the years, both as part of citizens groups visiting Kashmir, as well as meeting Kashmiri women coming to Delhi and speaking to people here in the women's movement. So as always, women bear the brunt of armed conflict, especially if it's prolonged, of crackdowns, of cordon and search operations, and all kinds of what they call security checks. More and more, I want to say that in today's world, if you hear the word security, you have to start getting worried, especially if you're a woman or if you come from particular parts of the country. Rape is the preeminent instrument of punishment, intimidation, coercion, and humiliation, and it is used freely. Bringing the rapist to book is practically impossible. To begin with, the police are reluctant to register FIRs against members of the troops. Then there are strange expressions which describe this abnormal situation. There's something called enforced disappearance. Enforced disappearance. There's something called half widows. Not full widows, but half widows. Strange new terms become current when the inexcusable happens year after year. What is enforced disappearance? Thousands of people, many of them married men, have been subject to enforced disappearance by state agencies. So suddenly they get picked up and they disappear. And you can spend year after year looking for them. Now these men have mothers, sisters, daughters, wives. And in the absence of information about the men, the wives become what are called half widows, because you don't know whether the husband is dead. So they become half widows. Now, why do half widows bear extra suffering? They're left without entitlement to land, homes, inheritance, pensions, or social assistance. If the family says, if the in-laws say, we can't look after you, they face the threat of destitution. And of course, they are more vulnerable to harassment by the troops. Now, what happens when year after year you live with this kind of uncertainty that if you send your children to school, you don't know if they'll come back safe. If your husband goes to work, you don't know whether he'll come back. If you're going to the market, you don't know if somebody will pick you up. This continuous fear, psychiatric disorders thrive in such a climate of unpredictability. So you can't see these wounds. There are many wounds in these places which you can't see with your eyes. But you can see that over the years, there's been a sharp increase in mental illness among women. From sleeping disorders, which means either some of these women sleep too much, they're not able to get up, or they're not able to sleep at all. Depression, and something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is that you continue to be frightened even after whatever was scary has happened to you. So many Kashmiri women speak of crippling fears. If you ask them, what do you want in life? The word that is most important to them is the word normalcy. Yen beko, normala irbeko. What is normalcy? You get up and you go outside the house without worry. Everybody goes to work without worry, and the children go to school, they can get an education, then they can get a job. That is normalcy. What we all want for our children and our families. So the women suffer unbearable odds, coping with anxiety, not just their mental health, but the mental health of children who have not seen a life without fear or violence ever. I want to share a small story with you. This is universal. Children who have seen warfare, who have not understood why some people who don't even belong where they live are suddenly coming and doing terrible things to them. When I was a very young woman and I was studying in America, I used to teach English to Americans, and one adopted child was from Vietnam. Every time a plane flew overhead, he would go and dive under the table, even though it was many years after the war. This is what happens to children. They are never the same again after the kind of experience, not only of seeing bulldozers breaking down their homes, but seeing members of their family dying before their eyes. Let me share the stories of just a few women I have met from Kashmir. There was a woman I met called Parveena. She looked exactly like anybody's mother. She could have been your mother or mine. But she's far from ordinary. I also want to say, as we talk about the terrible things these women and children have suffered, continuously on the other side of the screen, we have to remember their resistance, their bravery, how they continue to fight, not just in private space, but in public space. And Parveena is a great example because her son Javed was picked up by the security forces in 1990, and she's not heard anything of him since. So she set up something called the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, bringing all the parents together. So the movement includes all these very important practical political gestures. So bringing women together and saying, let's look for our disappeared persons, our disappeared families. So she goes wherever she's called, she tells these stories. And when I met her in 2012, she said that she was leading protests in a park every month for 22 years at that point. I don't know if she's still doing it. She said she will not stop till all the missing children get justice. So that is brave Parveena. Then there is I met a young woman called Lebul Nisa. She looked so delicate, so young, but she was a human rights lawyer and she works with half widows. So she told us that for 7 years the missing husband is not considered dead. So those 7 years, the half widow cannot remarry, she cannot claim property, she might not be educated enough to support herself or her children. So these are the problems, and this is how this young lawyer helps half widows survive. And she said there are no support structures for rehabilitation, employment, shelter, counseling, medical treatment. So this is what she's working towards. Then Insha, a researcher and activist, she says she grew up amid homes and schools torn apart by bombs, and she said something very important. She said, that is how I grew up, but I may be a victim, but I am also a fighter. So this, I think, is an important way also to see Kashmiri women. Their terrible suffering, but also their struggle, their being part of a resistance movement. And I just want to add a little extra to balance the picture. We heard a Kashmiri Pandit who had to leave the valley. So our suffering should also be counted, she said. We want to return without having to support any faction, because a lot of people get caught in the crossfire, what these days we call collateral damage. So in sum, what does militarization really mean? It means, the Kashmiri women said, that they are subject to the militarization of place, body, and mind. So we've looked at militarization. If we go to another part of the country, it's always good to look at our own country first before we go to other places. In Manipur, again, there's a very complex history here. And complex in what way? In terms of borders, in terms of migration, both pre-independence as well as post-independence, ethnicities, insurgencies, state repression, oppressive laws, identity politics. This is a lot for Gita to translate. Unfortunately, the history of conflict makes us all into academics. I'm not a professor, but it's forcing all of us to become professors and understand these very difficult words and phrases. The Northeast Network made a written submission to the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and they called it Women in Conflict and Post-Conflict Situations. So they said that the government of India does not use the term armed conflict, especially internationally, to refer to situations of armed conflict within the country. You know that the government of India suffers from something many of our Indian families also suffer from, which is money problems ella ille irbeko. Nobody else should know. You know, but these things are impossible today with media and technology. Nobody can pretend they don't know what is happening somewhere else in the world. So the root causes of these conflicts in India are extremely complex. They're linked to the social, political, and cultural history of the South Asia region. And the conflicts also in that area are of various kinds. So there are movements for greater autonomy, greater freedom, for self-determination, for secession, all ethnic identity-based. It could be communal, caste, or religious conflicts. It could be ideological. Most of these conflicts are inter-ethnic or inter-community or against the state or a combination. So the history here is a history of diversity. Usually we say diversity is one of our strengths, isn't it? Just looking at this room, you see the power of diversity. But there is also this side of diversity, especially when it is exploited, whether by colonizers or by governments or bad laws and so forth. There is also the history of resistance. And we must remember the history of resistance in this area starts with resistance against the colonizers, against the British, but also resistance against laws such as AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, that gives the security forces freedom to act in whatever way they want. Resistance in our circles is always a good word, but it also has a complex history. And Manipur is a good example of that. On the one hand, the mothers of Manipur, the Myra Paibis, a movement that began in the late 70s and early 80s, they staged a very historic protest against the Assam Rifles in July 2004 to protest against the rape and custodial killing of a woman called Tanjam Manorma by Assam Rifles personnel. They protested in front of their fort where the soldiers are stationed by, these are old women. They took off their clothes and held up a banner saying, "Indian Army, rape us." So this was a very, very powerful, you can imagine how desperate they were to make a show of resistance. But all these years later, what has happened to this amazing movement? They too have got embroiled in the identity crisis, the divisions in the region. So they have got divided along ethnic lines as Meitei and Kuki-Zo. So Manipur today remains deeply divided along these ethnic lines. So the Meitei community dominates the valley and the Kukis are in the hills. In between are the federal paramilitary forces. So there's been long-standing tension between the communities over quotas and government grants. So what happens when a place like this is divided into two ethnic areas hostile to each other? And you must remember, there are others as well. There are Nagas, there are people from other parts of India and so on. And how does this affect women and children in particular? First, you have the same old story: violence, sexual abuse, death, displacement, abduction, curfew, complete disruption of normal life, being caught between militants of both sides and security forces, family separation, education interrupted or ended. I must tell you that I met a young Manipuri girl here in Bangalore, and we started talking, and she told me that she couldn't go back to college. She is the daughter of an intermarriage. Her mother is Kuki and her father is Meitei. So what happens? So she has left and she's in Bangalore trying to do odd jobs. She has not, so she's worrying about her family all the time. These are the practical ways in which, at the one extreme you have death and rape and horrible things, but you also have this day-to-day strain, the day-to-day increase of prejudice. Because when people are separated from each other, they know less and less about the other, and they are more and more willing to believe awful stories about the other. So, other than all these problems, you have the restoration of laws such as AFSPA, laws which already have a very unhappy history. So this is the big question. What is the way out of identity assertion politics? If you can only see yourself as Mete and so cookies are the enemy, or if you can only see yourself as cookie and Metes are the enemy. The big lesson seems to be, once you begin dividing people, no matter whether it is religion, caste, class, ethnicity, any of the other dividers can follow. Which is why we come back to the big picture of what is happening in the country and what is happening to our political situation. It is not just Hindu-Muslim. Once you start dividing people, you're going to have endless old identities, new complaints, old complaints coming to the fore and creating fresh problems, violence, and misery for the common people. I've traveled in Palestine and have been associated with universities there and activists there. And so I really want to share some of those stories with you. So we've seen how militarization is hard enough for people, in particular women and children, to live with. We've seen 2 examples of that within our country. But sadly, there is something worse than militarization. And that is the chronic situation of occupation. I say chronic because, the doctor will say this is temporary. This infection in 48 hours, it'll go away. This trouble will go away shortly. It's short term. But chronic means that generation after generation will live with this occupation. You've never seen anything in your life but occupation. So, this is what I saw in Palestine. In 2013, I visited Palestine for the first time. It was also the first time, since I was born after we got independence, it was the first time I saw what occupation looks like and what it means for ordinary people, what it means for school children, what it means for the pregnant woman, what it means for the farmer. What I saw was what we call the terrible effects of settler colonialism. So, we were lucky. It's a strange thing to say that our colonialism was a better one. It sounds funny, but it was not settler colonialism. So if they come and take over your land and you become an alien, a foreigner in your own land, that is settler colonialism. That is what happened to the Native Americans. That has what has happened to the Palestinians, because they said this was a land without a people. So, which is what happened in 1948, which the Palestinians remember as the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, when people were either killed or they were pushed out. And that is how you have Palestinians all over the world. So today what is happening is what Palestinians call the ongoing Nakba, which means they haven't got over the occupation. The colonizers are still there. And remember, my experience of Palestine, this visit I'm talking about, was in 2013, well before this last current year of catastrophic violence, which we can only call genocide. So what does occupation look like? What does it do to the lives of women and children on a day-to-day basis? So let me describe some of what I saw even in the supposedly good days, leave alone the times now when bombs are falling and people are being shot freely. One is movement. What is left of Palestine is a tiny strip. It's a tiny strip. You can go up and down. For us Indians, it's ridiculous. It's just a little bit. And there, movement is so curtailed that you have checkpoints everywhere. I remember in each checkpoint I would touch my Indian passport and say, oh, thank goodness, I'm Indian. Because at the checkpoint, there are young people, young boys and girls with guns. And if they're looking at their cell phones, which we all know young people like to do, and they don't want to bother with whoever's waiting, you have to wait. If you ask a question, they might be really rude to you, maybe slap you around. So at each checkpoint, you see old men sitting and waiting. You see pregnant women waiting. You might see an ambulance waiting. That is what the checkpoints are like. Then you have something called the wall. So if this is that strip of Palestine, what they have done is built a wall all around to separate the two physically. But of course, also to grab more of the land. So for example, it is typical that you could go to a farmer's house. I went to the house of a man called Abu Nidal. Nidal means struggle, sangarsh. Abu means father of. So Nidal is a very popular name in Palestine for boys. So Abu Nidal's olive fields, which are very old. This is an old land. And the olive trees are there and the wall is there in between. So he can't, leave alone going to his olive fields, he can't even look at the fields. That is not just occupation, but it's the spite of the colonizer. So that is there. Then school children, for example, suppose the wall is here and this is your house and the child could have gone to a school which was here, so nearby, 10 minutes walk, 5 minutes walk. But now because of the wall, that child has to go all around. It might take 45 minutes and in between there are checkpoints. So that is the other thing. Then water. So the settlements, the Israeli settlements are fabulous. They have swimming pools. They boast that they've turned this into a green land. But in Palestinian houses, you see water tanks. That's how you know that this is a Palestinian house. And if there's a settler on top, typically, actually, if you look around the world, the colonizer typically in hilly areas builds on top of the hills so they can see what the natives are doing. So you will see that the settlements are all above and they grab the springs with water. They grab whatever they can and they have excellent water supply and all the amenities, but the Palestinians don't. So what the policy is break them in increments. So each area, if this is a commercial area, break the business. If this is, that is Hebron. If this is a religious area, break them, in terms of religion, Jerusalem, and so on. I just want to mention about the historical background because just a quote. There is a wonderful Jewish historian who, Ilan Pape, when he came to India, he told us that in school, he was taught that as a little boy, he was told when we came to Palestine, when the West encouraged us, when the Western colonizers encouraged us to come and settle here and grab this land, there was nobody here. So Ilan Pape, as a little boy, must have been a great historian even then. He raised his hand and said, then what about all those people who were killed and thrown out? Weren't they here first? They sent him out of the class. Oh, go. So what I'm trying to say is there's resistance from rational people everywhere. So we are not going to fall, victim to the idea that it's not Jews versus Palestinians. It's Zionists versus Palestinians. Just as here today in India, it's not Hindus, it's Hindutwadis. quite interesting. It sort of brought to mind the kind of claims that are being made these days in India about something under, every mosque has something under it. Who knows, even this building might have something under it. So we went to this farmhouse which was constantly being attacked by settlers. They preferred to attack it when the men were at work and they could frighten the women and children and make them anxious, the way I've described, when women are, they don't know when they're going to be attacked and by whom. So on the grounds of this farm, there's a little water tank, and because people who come there and grab your land have to always invent a history. They claim, the Zionists claim, that Moses once bathed there. This is exactly like, Sita is supposed to have cooked in various parts of the country. Our country is littered with Sita's adge mane. So similarly, this was, to us Indians, this was a very familiar story. So Moses is supposed to have bathed there. So they said, give us this farm. Now this Abu Jamal, this farmer's name is, he was a very tough guy. So I don't want you to think of the Palestinians as, sort of pathetic. They are not made to be victims. So he said, okay, I'll give you my entire farm, but you return Jerusalem to us. So I thought, wow, he should have been one of the negotiators. But there, when you entered the farm, there were piles of stones. So his theory was that if somebody is coming in, it'll take them some time to remove the stones and go and threaten the women. But this is how they live. So this is another small example. This place called Hebron, in the old market, which is a very, very old historical market, you have netting above. And the settlers have their homes above that. So they don't need a truck to pick up their garbage. They throw their garbage, really horrible garbage, I don't even want to describe it, over the netting. And so, you walk down there. And it's a terrible experience as an Indian when you're walking with the Palestinian activists in that market. You see some lovely little child of the settlers, but the kind of gestures they make at you and how they spit. So this is how hatred functions in day-to-day life. Children suffer, but children also learn hatred. So they're suffering in yet another way. So this is something else to remember. So of course, the commerce, business, everything comes to a halt. You can only imagine what happens to women and children. But I also want to leave you with another image. I saw one beautiful house in front of the wall, and I just said, because this is a very beautiful place. The food is wonderful. There are happy people. They love to dance and sing. So I said, what is this building called? They said it's called Sumud. Sumud means steadfastness. It means we will never give up. So these are the mottos they live by. So all the time we are looking at their suffering, we have to look at their resistance. I just want to say that today, and this is important to look at what is happening there today. It is since October 7th, 2023, which is not the beginning of the problem. That is why I went back to 1948. The latest death toll as of December 1st week, I looked it up. It is 45,078 Palestinians. This side. In Israel, 1,139. we cannot balance lives and say these lives are more precious than these lives. But the numbers tell you the story. This is just those who were killed. There are more who are missing. There are more who are injured, possibly still under the rubble. That's what bombs and bulldozers do. The building falls and there are human beings under it. There are families, mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters under the rubble. Their homes are under the rubble. Hospitals, hospital tents once the hospitals are bombed. Schools, refugee camps attacked or reduced to rubble. Food, water, medical supplies, shelter, medical attention, all this is at an emergency level. So, the Palestinian Ministry of Health says that this is the number of those who are killed, and they break it down. After a while, we must remember that these numbers are people. They are not numbers. In Gaza, at least 44,532 people killed, including 17,492 children. More than 105,538 people injured. 11,000 missing. Then the occupied West Bank, because remember, Gaza is a little strip. It has been called the world's only open-air prison because people there have suffered so intensely. Now, in the occupied West Bank, which is where I went up and down in 2013, and where there is no war, supposedly, at least 803 people have been killed, 168 children killed, a lot of people picked up for questioning, more than 6,000 injured. And in Israel, officials actually revised the death toll from October 7th. They said, they said it was 1,405. Now they're saying it's 1,139. I'm not going to comment on that. Now, the World Health Organization, the UN, and all of them have said more than half of Gaza's homes are damaged or destroyed. 80% of commercial facilities, businesses destroyed. 87% of school buildings destroyed. Healthcare facilities, 17 hospitals are trying very hard to function. 68% of road networks gone. 68% of cropland gone. And as for children, again, let me tell you just a couple of stories. There's a 7-year-old Palestinian girl, Nana. She's asked, what do you want? What makes you happy? She wants a house, a garden, a warm meal, a sweet sun, and a clear sky. She says she doesn't want to see rubble. She wants to see her aunt who is under the rubble. Her neighbor, 13-year-old Osama, who wanted to become a soccer star, lost his leg. He's lost his cousins. He lost his mother while playing soccer, and the bombs fell down. Then a teenager said, I used to have big dreams, but the war has ruined them. And what we are doing is witnessing a genocide which is not, we are not even allowed to call it a genocide. So, but we know that it doesn't take a legal system or a scholar or an expert to describe what it is. There's one thing about the high-tech world we live in. It's hard to pretend ignorance of what is happening to real people in real places. Al Jazeera has reported that 80% of Gaza children suffer depression after 15 years of blockade. This is what is happening in Palestine. I want to, before Geeta takes over, I just want to add, other than the fact that we are human beings and we can't bear to see other human beings suffer, and children suffer, as Indians, why are we particularly invested in Palestine? Because it is not just a question of Palestinian freedom from occupation, it is a question of what kind of India do we want. Don't forget, we fought against colonizers. Gandhi said very clearly, though he had a lot of Jewish friends, a lot of Zionist friends, he said Palestine belongs to the Palestinians. This is what our freedom fighters from Gandhi to Nehru and others understood. That because we have suffered colonization, we have to be in solidarity with those who continue to suffer from occupation. That is the India we want. A country that stands in solidarity with those who are resisting occupation, those who are resisting warfare and oppression. So this is why it is so important for us to stand in solidarity with Palestine, to speak up, to pressurize our own government for its new alliance with Israel. Not only a cultural alliance, not only an economic alliance, but an alliance in terms of security as well as arms. So I'm just going to say very briefly in one sentence and then give it over to Geeta about Lebanon and of course now Syria, but we can go on adding and we will all be here all night. That more than a year of attacks in Lebanon has again meant human costs, especially for women and children, casualty, death, injury, evacuation. Like Gaza, there's hunger, the need is for food, water, shelter, medical supplies, essential supplies. That for women, as I said, discrimination and violence happen even in times of peace, but in conflict areas, in times of conflict, it is even worse. And this could include killings, torture, sexual violence, forced marriage. Very often, the conservatives become even more conservative in times of conflict, so women have an even harder time. Men and boys have also been victims of sexual violence, especially in contexts of detention. So we have to remember that. A growing population of the world's people is living in areas now where there is a backsliding of democracy. And all women, I think, know that in times of authoritarianism, you have much more misogyny. We should know that living in the times we are here. So, again, women and children suffer from the lack of delivery of essential services, getting education, healthcare, and so on. And even after the conflict is over, it takes a very long time for all those changes to go back to normalcy. So, in sum, women and girls should not only be seen as victims of conflict and instability, they have historically had and continue to have a role as combatants, as fighters, as part of organized civil society, as human rights defenders, as members of resistance movements, and active agents in both formal and informal peace building and recovery processes. In other words, we need to strengthen movements and our solidarity with all movements.